Hello and welcome to the Trauma Resonance Resilience podcast with me, Lisa Cherry, your host. And I'm so looking forward to today. I'm doing something a little bit different. Those of you that listen to the podcast will know that I have conversations with people that seek to work with services and people who seek for people to recover from the harm of trauma, not add to it. And because I'm doing this series at the moment around COVID-19 and the implications across all the different sectors, that means that this will not be edited in the usual way. So please bear with. Just to add to the podcast being very different today, I woke up this morning and I thought, because we had this planned for some time and I'll be introducing you to our guests very shortly. As I roused from my sleep, I thought to myself, how fun would it be to do a podcast live? And that was this morning. So this morning, I decided I was going to put this out as a webinar and give recording it as a webinar a go, with people being able to join in. And within 3 hours, the 100 spaces were pretty much gone, which tells me that we are absolutely in need of this conversation. And the conversation will be, of course, looking at the re-entry into school prior to what's been happening. And there's some lovely comments coming in as I speak. Before I get going, what I'd really also like to say is that at 3:06, we will be stopping for a minute. And we're doing that for the 96 men, women and children who were crushed to death in Hillsborough in 1989 on the 15th of April. So we will stop for 1 minute and have a minute's silence. And I can't think of anything more appropriate than a community trauma such as Hillsborough being part of a conversation about a community trauma that we are experiencing currently, albeit in a very different way. That just leaves me to introduce you to Mary Meredith, Head of Inclusion, North Links, and Steve, Behaviour Specialist, 25 years plus in education. And I think for the format today, because there's going to be so many questions, and there are so many questions, I've had questions by email. There will be questions coming up in the webinar chat, which I'm going to try and keep an eye on. So I think the format for today, what I would say is I was inspired to have Mary and Steve on the podcast when I observed a conversation they were having on Twitter. And I just felt this was a broader conversation that we all need to have a seat at the table at. And start to deepen our understandings about what it actually is going to mean for our children, all our children, to be re-entering school. And of course, what it's going to mean for how schools manage that, and what it's going to mean for those children who do not have that relational resource that some children have and some children don't, and all the other complexities. So, Mary, can I hand over to you just to kind of bring to the fore the stuff you've been writing about, thinking about and talking about in relation to this?
Yes, sure. Well, you've introduced me already as Head of Inclusion, so I suppose that boils down to really trying to reduce exclusions in Lincolnshire, and actually we've made some really good progress around that. But the attempt to reduce exclusion inevitably brings you to trauma, because when you casework excluded children, as my team does, you start to see a really strong pattern, which isn't necessarily captured in the DFE statistics in those categories, which is that the vast majority have experienced trauma. You know, our PRUs are settings that are teeming in trauma. There's lots of bereavement, there's mental health issues with parents, family breakdown, all of that. It is almost a defining feature really of excluded children, and that seems a great tragedy, you know, that the best we can do to disadvantaged children is compound that disadvantage through exclusion. So it's something I've been looking at for the last couple of years with the sector in Lincolnshire, and we've got some training around trauma. We've worked with people like Dr. Karen Traisman, and I'm running a book study group looking at Dr. Perry's book. And I suppose my concern is that actually when schools reopen, they are, like our PRUs, going to be teeming in trauma. There'll be children who are experiencing bereavement, but then there's already all the secondary risks as well that the Children's Commissioner wrote to the Chancellor about, the domestic violence, the children in temporary accommodation, poverty. All of those things are going to be bearing down on children, and it's going to be really difficult for them. We know it's difficult for them because so many don't cope with school when they're living these stress-filled lives. So we could see inclusion carnage, which I don't want to see unless we really prepare for their return in a trauma-informed way. And I think there's something around just keeping that simple, some really clear messages. And I think my hope is that when educators understand just the basics of trauma, actually, that they're more than ready to make changes such that children can be a place, such that schools, can be a place where children heal, rather than their issues being exacerbated, which I think is what happens when schools aren't trauma informed.
Can I ask you something, Mary, just that was coming into my mind, because we've been working on this for a very long time. We've been really, myself and Karen actually were talking about this yesterday, the work that we've done at trying to support schools into trauma-informed approaches and relational approaches. And you do that work, and you do that work, Steve, and so many people do that work. But as well as I do, that there are lots of people who have a real resistance to that work. And there are head teachers who have a real resistance to that work. Do you think that people will come out of the other side of this, because it's going to be really difficult for nobody to be touched, for anyone to not be touched by what's happened? Do you think that those people who've previously had a resistance to understanding some of this stuff will have moved in their thinking?
I'm hopeful about that. And I must admit, my experience is that professionals aren't resistant once you've got in through the door. And I think the thing about trauma-informed practice is that it does have a neurobiological basis. There's facts that we can work with there. And that's, for me, why it's been a better approach than sort of talking about, say, restorative practice, because people can say, yeah, okay, that's fine, but I don't believe in it, doesn't work here. And this cuts through all of that. And almost I think it's about the knowledge and sharing the knowledge, and then allowing in the way people to find their own solutions. Once they understand, for example, we've got to try and reduce stress, not induce stress, then strategies occur to people. So it's not really about even telling schools what to do. It's just, these are the facts. When a child has a dysregulated nervous system, the first thing we've got to do is ground and regulate them. How do you go about that here? And it's about those sorts of conversations and looking at what's already happening around that's really useful, and building on that. I guess working with rather than imposing methodology, if that makes sense.
It kind of does. And Danielle's just popped in that I'm not understand why a professional would resist. There are some really interesting conversations on Twitter that tell me that there are people who, even when presented with the science, which we've heard that phrase a lot in the last few weeks, haven't we, are still struggle to understand what it is that's being put forward. So there are people that I have seen have those conversations. I tend not to get into them myself.
They're not very productive by and large, because these are closed minds, and pay attention to the good stuff, pay attention to what's working well, and grow that, I think.
Yeah, and that's what led me to sort of think, does what's happened, that's an opportunity for shifting, I think. That's an opportunity for thinking about things in a different way than perhaps were being thought about before. And I think we might see that with Boris.
Well, there is such thing as society, which is helpful in this context, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a movement. If you're impacted by adversity, which lots of people are going to be who perhaps hadn't been or hadn't had a lot of adversity around them, then that's going to shift the way people think.
I think if I could just come in here, one of the things that I've been thinking about alongside how is we can best support the children and young people is very much thinking about the adults in schools. Last week I started to mind map my initial thoughts as to some of the different ways in which the coronavirus has and is impacting upon children and young people. And at the risk of stating the obvious, it was ditto the adults. And so thinking about adults coming back into schools, I think that many, if not all of them, are going to come back into the schools and into the classroom changed, for want of a better phrase. And I think here of a mantra that I love, and I'm always preaching it. It's from Parker Palmer, that good teaching cannot be reduced to technique. Good teaching comes from the identity and the integrity of the teacher. And if we think about it from the point of view of identity and integrity in the classroom, each individual teacher is coming in with their own identity, and their identity will have been shaped over these weeks and months. And if integrity is around what values we hold to and our endeavours to walk as closely aligned to those values with integrity, I'm wondering what it is that might be being stirred up within individual teachers and school leaders during this time as they start to prepare at whatever point in time to go back into the classroom, to go back into the schools and to welcome the children and young people back in.
Yeah.
I think related to that, and another reason to be hopeful, is this notion of post-traumatic growth, and the fact that I read yesterday, extraordinary statistic, that 90% of victims actually experience some element of post-traumatic growth, be that, a better appreciation of the small things, or improved relationships, or some sort of spiritual connection with the world. Those things do happen to 90% of children. So if you think about a school staff and the children, we've all been reflecting, haven't we? Reevaluating, rethinking our values, making resolutions perhaps to move forward in a different way, to value people more, possessions less, that kind of thing. So when we return to our schools, it gives leaders an awful lot to work with, doesn't it? If they can just harness this desire of people to do things differently, to be more appreciative, to reach out, to actually look after the vulnerable, as we have been through COVID, and perhaps we weren't very well before. If that can be seized, it could be really transformational, I think. There's such an opportunity here.
I couldn't agree more. And what strikes me is it's that phrase that this is going to be a process. It's a process of reintegration. It's a process that is not going to be linear. It will be cyclical. And I think that the more that educators and school leaders can be supported in understanding that, because we are very used to an education system that is linear in its approach. So to understand that it's cyclical, that there will be moves forward and then moves backwards. And I've lost my thread there. So it was about it being a process. Yeah, and that it's going to take time. And again, I've noticed on Twitter, a lot of school leaders are saying we cannot go back to how we were doing things before. So is it that we wait for permission from, for example, the government and DfE to say, do you know what, you go at it at a certain pace, and we will lift some of the pressures off of you? Or are we going to have to, as a professional body, say, we have to do this at a considered pace here and not rush it? Because if we rush it, that's where we could get the negative impact. But like you're saying, Mary, I totally agree. I feel very optimistic that this really is a moment in time for schools and for society as a whole. But we need time, and it's where the permission comes from. Or do we give it ourselves to take that time?
And I think we've seen with social care, they've actually took it themselves and said, no, we're not bringing COVID-19 into our residential homes. And I just think if social care can do it, then any sector can do it.
Yeah.
There's so many comments coming up, it's hard to keep up, but I just wanted to come back to this adversarial growth, because that's something that came up in thinking around, I saw a conversation, and I can't remember what the conversation was about, but certainly around isolation and being alone was something that people that I've spoke to who were care experienced adults talked about, that period of being a care leaver and feeling very alone, and how this felt like nothing compared to that. So there's something about, now I imagine that some of that recovery process from that experience was not buffered by the kind of relationships we want for our children. But the opportunity for adversarial growth from thinking about narrative and story about who we are as a school. How do we manage adversity as a school? How do we recover as a school? How do we come out of this experience as a school? And in an ideal world, families are having those conversations as well. Who are we in adversity, and how do we come out of this? There's so many comments on the side. It's a job to keep going with them. But I'm wondering if it's okay with you two. Do you mind if I put some of the stuff forward that came via email, and then I'll go to the Q&As that are building up in the Q&A box on here. So I think one of the things that I'm going to start with, I'll start with Colin actually, because it wasn't just Colin. Where's my phone? It wasn't just Colin. An email actually came in about the same area, and that was from Amanda Porter. So Amanda and Colin were talking about transitions. So Colin's put, what should we be planning for those primary school children who ordinarily would be starting big school in September? The majority of our year 6 pupils attend schools where the number of pupils in the entire school is smaller than the number in one year group in the biggest secondaries. And staying with that, there were other, actually her email's really long, so I'm going to leave that. I'm going to put that one out there. There were definitely lots of questions around transitions. What kind of thinking are you having about how we might be able to do that?
I've got a bit of work going on in the background with our behaviour service and mental health services as well around transition. So we're going to be producing something in a week or two, but it is quite difficult, isn't it, without knowing the timescales at the moment and what's possible. So, you know, will schools open during summer for year 7, 6 into 7, for example? Nobody knows, because, you know, we haven't peaked yet. We don't know when we'll peak, do we? I mean, I think almost we've got to think about all of the children as new starters, and go back to basics around because there will be new routines, won't there, that I think will be necessary to keep everybody safe, and everybody's going to need to feel safe. You know, that they're joining a community again, and some of them will have internalised the view that other people are a threat to life. So it's not going to be easy necessarily, this coming together. And so I think really thinking that through and putting things in place for everybody will help the ones that are also, you know, brand new to the school as well. But I appreciate that we need to do further work around that particularly vulnerable cohort, because some of them will be really anxious about it, and not having had their, you know, transition days and so on, not having the familiar faces established. Probably the answers are going to be partially virtual. So the check-ins that are happening now virtually from primary pastoral staff will need to be handed over, so that year 6 knows who their form tutor is, can ask. There's an ongoing sort of dialogue before they start, sharing information about exactly what the first day is going to look like, what the routine is going to be, and having a way, you know, of responding to worries virtually, I think.
I like that though, Mary, before I come to you, Steve, that idea about thinking about all the children coming back in and new starters, actually. And that might hold place. Yeah. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I was just I wanted to pull up actually something very much building upon what Mary was just saying. If I can just pull this up and just share this with you. I've been looking very much at all of this from the point, he says, trying to find this. Let me just see if I can share this with you. Looking at it very much from a developmental point of view. I don't know what, are you able to see that now?
Yes.
Yeah. So looking at it from a developmental point of view, and this idea, and I'll perhaps come on to this a little bit later as well, but this idea that there are very distinctive developmental stages that we all move through, that life is a cycle of development. And this idea of there being a stage called the becoming stage, and really supporting schools and settings from the point of view of considering how it is that they can help the children and young people, whether or not they are year sixes moving through to year sevens or at any age in the school process, to start to get these developmental tasks or growing up jobs under their belt here. So we've got to become aware of the move to the new class, school placement, to gain familiarity with future carers and location, which is something similar, Mary, what you were saying there about how they're going to need some form of contact with tutors beforehand. To experience being separate and connected at the same time. Well, my goodness me, isn't that exactly what is happening for our children and young people? They are separate from their schools and from their classrooms and from their peers, and yet we're also needing to get that sense of connection going on for them. But particularly in terms of practically then, so these are all things that are very standard transitional principles. And thinking about, so how is it then that schools can build their transition process around these affirmations? So we are pleased that you are coming here. So again, that's that pre coming into school contact that they're having with the pupils. Your needs and safety are important to us. That is going to be such a big one, I foresee, and I'm sure that we'd all agree there. It is important anyway for us all to have a sense of safety, but given the trauma and the shock that these youngsters are experiencing and will come back to school with, I would imagine that some time and energy is going to have to go around how it is that we actually communicate and reassure children and youngsters that their needs and safety are important to us. Looking at practical ways to let them know that you've already got a connection with them, and giving them some time and space to be as they are. And this again, I think, Mary, comes back to the point that both you and Lisa were talking about right at the beginning around the importance of staff being trauma informed. The more that we can understand about how trauma impacts upon behaviour, we can look beyond that behaviour to hopefully look at what underlying needs are being communicated there, and then hopefully it will pave the way for more of that unconditional positive regard, which the children are going to need, and indeed staff are going to need as well.
Yeah, thank you ever so much for that, Steve. Yeah, and just to go back, it wasn't Amanda, it was Claire who was talking about, before all this happened, she was planning on preparing her year 6 pupils who are all currently permanently excluded and attending a PRU, and they were going to be transitioning into a mainstream secondary. And obviously this will now be very limited support, and Claire would be very keen on advice or resources that could help. I mean, certainly I think that's a whole other podcast of its own, isn't it? And I'm thinking about somebody like Sarah Dove, who specifically around alternative provision. Happy, Claire, to respond to your email later on with some contacts. Then moving into another question that came, I'm keeping an eye on the time, so we have 1 minute silence at 3:06. This one is from Helen Harvey. When children return to school, anxiety levels will be heightened with all children and adults. And I think we've really had that as a flavour that's been ongoing. More so with children who've experienced adversity and with underlying attachment issues. What is the best way to approach the recent events, enabling the individuals to start the long journey to feel safe and secure? So in a way, that's a bit more of what we've been talking about. Let's put some kind of meat around that. Which one of you would like to take that?
Mary, if you're happy for me to just dip in there, I'll keep an eye on time as well here, because it might actually, I said I've been looking at this from a developmental perspective. And the only preparation I really did for this was just to make sure that I had a few slides that might be helpful. And I'm more than happy just to say that these resources that I'm going to share, people can contact me and I'll send them out. I'll put together a resource pack for them. But in terms of supporting pupils around anxiety and the like, again, from a developmental perspective, it might be helpful to look at this, looking at, and it's a resource that quite a few people have come across, the behaviour wall. And like I say, I can make this available for people, but in terms of supporting youngsters, then if I just get this up here, if I just bear with me for one moment, just wanted to pull up the PDF. Here we go. Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the time as well here, but the behavioural is basically a way of tracking youngsters in terms of their emotional development. And each different layer of bricks corresponds to a different developmental stage, right from birth all the way through to and including the teenage years. When we're talking about trauma, it's really helpful to consider which of these specific developmental tasks or growing up jobs a youngster might be revisiting. So when they come back into the classroom, they're going to want a lot of reassurance. They'll be finding their ways to be calling for care, to starting to attach and form those secure attachments with their teacher and with other staff there. And so it is very much around, it isn't about regressing, but it is going back and revisiting that particular developmental stage. So teachers may well find that there are a number of children in their classes who will be very, in inverted commas, needy of attention, needing of that reassurance. And framing it from this point of view, it helps to normalize those behaviors. It also then gives us a way into it, because what we can then do in terms of practically, because I appreciate people always want to know what to do practically here, is that what you then do is that you then build your support around these affirmations. So just as a few minutes ago I was looking at the becoming stage, it is the same principle. You've got the developmental tasks, which were the red bricks here, but then building around, so building your support plan around these affirmations. So I'm thinking in particular here, if you can feel all of your feelings. So how is it then that staff lets children know and young people know that it's okay to be feeling a bit wobbly, a bit anxious, maybe even a bit tearful at times? And this is where I think there's going to be a lot of work. I say a lot of work, certainly some work that we need to be done, led by the school leadership team around supporting teachers to create that safe space within their classrooms, to foster that sense of it's okay to feel how you're feeling, to develop that sense of belonging there. And that this will, yeah, sure, please do, yeah.
There, Steve, because
let me
I think one of the things that there's a few comments coming up I'm noticing, and also that I'm thinking about, which is what we have to have before then is all of that stuff that you're talking about has to be like that for the staff.
Yep, absolutely.
And I know that because we're trainers and we go into schools and we've done a lot of the groundwork before we even get near the rest of the staff in a school, but not everybody here might understand that that's the case, and that we're making a bit of an assumption by not mentioning the staff, because of course that's vital, that any of that work has to be modelled between all of the staff with each other, and that has to be driven by the ability to feel safe. It's about feeling safe, isn't it, in your staff team?
Can I just come in there with that? I can't help but think about a chapter in Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, which is the one about the Waco Siege, where there was a religious cult. I don't know if you remember it in the news. It's back in the 90s. And there was a siege of that cult. The children were taken away and put in a residential home immediately afterwards, highly traumatized, because many of them had been sexually abused as brides of the cult leader. They'd been severely punished, beaten, totally inconsistent sort of environment where sometimes, you know, they were praised and other times that they were sort of locked away. A horrific history of abuse. And so all these children brought together in this residential home, not knowing what was happening to their parents, who were still caught up in the siege. And Dr. Perry and his team were brought in to deal with that, to try and help the children through. And his message in that chapter is really hopeful in its simplicity, because he said the most important thing to do actually was just to let the children be. So there was no intense sort of post-traumatic therapy happening. In fact, he sort of advises against that. It can be counterproductive if we try and poke around in children's heads too soon. But what was really important was what he describes as the therapeutic web of relationships that developed around the children. So they gravitated towards the adults that they felt comfortable with, you know, the compatible personalities. There were kind interactions, tender moments, and gradually through that they were grounded and calmed. But it was a sort of a natural process which easily sort of translates into a school, I think. And I think the message for staff is actually the little things that you do and say, the smiles, the nods, the house gran, together, they have a powerful impact. So it's about saying to staff, let's just think about ourselves as humans first. Relationships, absolutely the priority. And we will help children recover just through that. The other thing we talked about was the importance of routine, which obviously creates a sense of safety as well. And schools lend themselves to that. You know, many children will be struggling outside of the school routine, so it'll be immediately helpful for them just to be back and having a school day and having a structure.
Absolutely, yeah.
But if we put relationships first, then we're going to go a long way, I think, towards helping children recover in a therapeutic climate.
And I think that what comes to my mind is how it is that we can care for the teachers and the staff. Looking at the murmurings, it feels like, and we don't know yet, that there'll be a date set for schools to return, and that'll be it. They'll be back in. And in my dreams, what I'd like would be for all schools to have at least a week of just starting, just the staff settling back in, reconnecting with one another. I was thinking only yesterday about, can you imagine the emotional atmosphere that's going to be created in a staff room when staff first come back together again? Staff need time to bed back in, to reconnect, to get that sense of safety, to catch up, to breathe, and then to be fit and ready to then welcome the children and young people back in. Now that feels like a pipe dream. I don't think that they will have that. I was going to say luxury. It shouldn't be a luxury, but that's perhaps how it would be framed. But if we can't do that, how else is it then that school leaders, and again it comes back to supporting school leaders in the first instance as well, supporting them to be grounded before they welcome the staff back and the children back.
There are quite a lot of school leaders that are present today, which I think is fantastic.
Yes.
I just want to bring Jerry into the room because he's ahead of Clyde High, and I know they're passionate about being trauma informed and are very much on the journey of being trauma responsive as well. And he has been putting up loads of comments, but I can't keep on top of all the comments at the side. So he's actually sent an email. Do you think that this period of lockdown, and I think this is a bit like the question I asked earlier really, has highlighted the importance of school intervention programs as part of the curriculum, initiatives such as mindfulness, nurture, robust vulnerability or resilience, and those buffers. And I think that's an interesting thing for us to ponder really. And I love what you're saying about staggered returns. I think, why wouldn't that be for some people, for some teachers, for some children?
Yeah.
Those teachers are going to need to settle their own children back in. Jerry is not a head, but he is a supportive head. He has a supportive head. Oh, okay. Not getting involved with that one. We're coming up shortly to, it's the head of nurture. That's still ahead, that's fine. We're coming up shortly to 1506. So I'm just going to read out one or two comments before we have our minute silence. Really pleased to hear Mary mention relationships and the priority that relationships are, because we know, of course, relationships are the buffer that we need and that also help us build resilience in adversity. It's now 1506, so if you please join me in a minute's silence to remember the 96 men, women and children who died in Hillsborough in 1989. Thank you. And thank you, Mary, for the beautiful bird song in the background. That was lovely. Okay. So, very poignant thinking about community trauma, bringing Hillsborough into that space. Very. Another question I have is really thinking about, I suppose, a more medical model to what might be appearing at school. So this one is from Claire Hunter. With the already stretched CAMS, is there likely to be, now bear in mind with all these questions, we're all working this stuff out. We don't necessarily have the answers, but we do all want to be part of the conversation. Is there likely to be any other organisation or service set up to take the very likely higher number of children who will need access to this service, some more urgently than others? Or will there be an opportunity to train more staff to work in the service? I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I know none of us have the answer, but that's an interesting kind of way of thinking about that, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, go, Mary.
I suppose it's that thing, the mantra in the trauma-informed field, that when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Seems to me very relevant in relation to the CAMS question, whether the solutions are in a clinic or whether they're much more in the environment that the child lives day to day. So I'm not discounting the need for some children to have that level of help, but I think there's untapped potential in schools, and I think actually, you know, even if all they do is stop inducing stress, doing the wrong things, that will make a difference.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I don't know if the answer, I don't even think actually you would ever have a service big enough for this, would you? I don't think the answer can be a service. It's got to be that the world the children live in, and if that means a bit of a different world, then so be it, because I think it would be a better one, actually.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Go on. I was just going to say, I was just mindful there of the psychiatrist Irvin Yalom, and his mantra is, it's the relationship that heals, it's the relationship that heals, it's the relationship that heals, which for me comes back to, and this is where again there is that sense of optimism that whilst we still have quite a strong emphasis towards a more behaviourist approach in quite a lot of schools still, more and more schools moving towards a relational approach, and this is exactly what's going to be needed. It bears out what you were just saying there, Mary, and what I'm sure you're about to come in with there, Lisa, which again then comes back to, so how do we support the staff? How do we support the staff to bring their best to their classrooms? I think I just caught a glimmer of a comment within the questions, which was very much around how how you can only give out what you've actually got yourselves. And thinking about how being in the classroom is essentially, yes, it is about subject knowledge, but at its essence, it's about, a lot of it is around balancing structure and nurture. And we do that most effectively when we have been topped up ourselves. So for me, the whole staff wellbeing side of things is going to be absolutely crucial here, because in that way, we will then start to help to reduce any possible toxicity within the school system and the school communities themselves, which goes back to what you were saying there, Mary, about wanting to I'm not going to say get the environment right, but to attend to the environment, and let's see what we can do to enhance it.
Yeah.
I think as well, maybe there's a need to develop a sort of pedagogy around relationships, because you know, I've read on Twitter, I suppose more from the traditional side of the fence, that if we get the routines right and the systems and establish calm and order, then relationships will develop. And I think there's some truth in that, but it's also much more than that. And I think we've got to wake up to the fact that actually our most vulnerable children don't feel a relationship with school. We've got loads of evidence going back to the 60s that they feel a sense of an alienation from school. I was looking at some research around extracurricular activity yesterday, which are great opportunities for relationship building. 6% of children engage in those compared to nearly half of middle class children. So our schools aren't really set up to develop strong relationships, or our cultures aren't reaching out to the group, to the children who are going to need us the most at the moment. So we're going to have to be deliberate about it. It's not going to necessarily happen in any kind of an organic way or by osmosis, and we've got to go for the children.
Well, it won't
who do need, because it won't happen.
Well, it won't happen when people, for whatever reason, for whatever life experience, don't understand what it's like to live without relationship. Because if you have a sense of what it is to have been a child without relationship, and you understand what you've had to do to build relationship, and you've understood what was not given to you and what you did have in terms of relationship, it alters the way you view relationships. If you've always had attachment relationships that you take for granted, then you don't spend any time thinking about how you make the kind of relationships that make a difference, that matter. And
yeah,
so
you're going to draw people to you, aren't you, with all your social skills and your warmth. And
we just bring to the party what we bring to the party.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, actually. I like this idea of a pedagogy around understanding relationships, because certainly when I go out and do training, that's one of the things we do. We have a little look at our relationships and bring into the room the fact that for some children, what you take for granted as a relationship, or what you take for granted as what you have when you go home, or what your children have when they go home, is not the way the world is for lots and lots of children. And I think the moment people tap into that is when everything changes. The moment people understand, I am privileged by my relationships, I have relational resources, and this child has relational poverty, then everything changes.
Coming back to that Waco story, it was interesting. Dr. Perry tracked the pupils into adulthood, or the children into adulthood. Some went on to recover completely and have, fulfilling, successful lives. Others didn't. And the thing that made the difference was the number and quality of relationships they had after the trauma. It wasn't how intense the abuse was or how terrible the trauma at all. It was all about that relational web that they had access to, or they didn't. And we know in our schools too many children don't have that, and we've got to be strategic about it.
I agree. I think that's absolutely fantastically put. And it's those kind of relationships where I see you and you see me, and we're okay with that, and we have that moment, and then we have that moment on top of moment on top of moment, which Bruce Perry calls that relational drip feed, I think, something like that. Dosing. It's relational dosing. And I think you're right. If we're just sitting back expecting that to happen organically, then we don't understand relationships, because there's not a relationships take work, they take connection. So thank you for bringing that into the room. All right, I'm going to move into the Q&A. So first question came in at 2:31. We may have answered this question. How do we support colleagues in order that we may then support our children? You want to take that?
I'm happy to pick up a bit of that. Already I'm doing some coaching with some leaders and pastoral staff, and what's coming through there loud and clear is how for some staff they're definitely benefiting from having that space to process something of what's going on here, and processing, trying to make a bit of sense as to what's going on for them. And it's already got me thinking, so how is it we might start to scale that up in some shape or form here? Supporting colleagues, I think just as we're needing to let the children and young people know that they can feel all of their feelings, how are school leadership teams going to communicate that to their own staff? And you've probably come across the idea, such a simple idea, the wobble rooms that are being set up in NHS trusts, where staff can just go and have a wobble emotionally. Now, schools say they don't have the space, etc., etc. I appreciate all sorts of practical implications around that. But I think, again, for leaders to at least be considering the question, how are we going to support our staff? How is it that we can give space and permission for them to have those wobbles, and what support can we draw in, indeed externally as well as internally, to help staff through that? I think there's a lot here around giving people permission to be, and that is hard in a school, because the business of school is essentially, it seemed to be teaching and learning. So how do we create that time and space? And I'm saying that it will be a challenge for some schools, and for other schools, I know there are many schools out there who will be fantastic. That will be uppermost in leaders' minds there.
Brilliant, thank you. I think that's, again, we could spend an hour talking about that, because I think that's such an important subject. I expect you've had this question already, but what about the children who are finding life better without school? Now, that's a big question. Who would like to start with that?
Go on, Mary, you're nodding away there.
Twice to my daughter, actually.
Yeah.
My youngest daughter has ASD, recently diagnosed, and school's really stressful for her, and she's been quite poorly, actually. She's open to CAMHS, and we've really tried to take this as an opportunity for her to get better, to recover. That's not to say school haven't been flexible, they have, but it's just a very, very difficult environment, and she's already anxious about going back. So in a way, even though they haven't struggled away from school, they're still a concern, because the step back is going to be harder for the children that are okay now. So how do we support them? I mean, for her, I've talked to her about what school could do, and she just wants to know in detail what it's going to feel like, what the routines are going to be. She wants to do some sort of advanced reading, because she's just about to start A-level, that kind of thing. So I suppose it's about anticipating the questions that children will have about going back and trying to answer them in advance so that they can prepare. The virtual contacts help as well. They've been ongoing, but it's true. This isn't a terrible time for some children. It's the best time.
Yeah, if they're in an environment at home as well, that's supportive, loving, nurturing, and safe, why wouldn't it feel better if that's not what they get from the school experience? And lots of children we know just don't feel like that at school for all sorts of reasons.
I mean, there'll be attendance issues. I think there'll be lots of children who don't want to go back, who really struggle. That's a challenge that we haven't talked about, but I think it's one we've got to be prepared for. Maybe phased returns for those children might be helpful. Not pacing things for them, not expecting too much too soon.
Yes,
having a differentiated approach to it, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I think that's a good suggestion. So Richard's been putting up different comments, but I just couldn't keep popping back in to get them. But we have a question from Richard here. Why do you think learning, this is a quite emotive question, in the areas of attachment theory, trauma and neurophysiology is still not part of initial teacher training?
Not long enough, is it really? Yeah.
Well, I guess that's one of the issues, isn't it? That it's a year's training rather than say a BEd, which was 4 years. You can incorporate all sorts of things into that.
Yeah.
I mean, what I would say that on a hopeful note, I quite agree. There's a massive, and I would say it is a deficit in terms of the initial teacher training. However, there are more and more institutions that are incorporating at least some input around attachment, and also reframing behaviour management as relational approaches. So we are seeing some inroads there, but we've still got a long way to go. We keep building on the positives.
Absolutely. I mean, I know for a start that Oxford Brookes incorporate all sorts of things into their work. That's John Reed and the team over there. Goldsmiths, a department, I'm pretty certain, also are incorporate. Certainly use my podcast in their reading list. I've got a friend who's going over to another department. She's going to be heading that, so I'm kind of thinking, right, that's sorted, that department as well. So, but it is still not across the board, Richard. I think it'd be fair to say. Colin, who's had to leave, has put a comment up that some of us might appreciate. Might we see that the DFE match the investment of 10 million in behaviour, the behaviour czar, and the strategy to address trauma? And who could be the trauma czar? I think that Heather Patterson, is there a possibility of a phased return, which Mary, you've mentioned a couple of times now in different circumstances, some children at a time so that adult-child ratios are lower and relationships can be given that time to redevelop and possibly repair? And Julie Gibbons has also looked at this idea of phased return, but there's a question mark there, so maybe that needs unpacking a little bit. Do you want to unpack any more around that? Mary, I think.
I think there's lots to be said for it, but in Lincolnshire there's huge logistical challenges around transport, so we literally couldn't do that. But I suppose in the unitary authorities, if it's possible, I think it's got to be a good idea, to have a small number of children to get to know and then to build on that.
But would it be the case, Mary, if we're going to use that analogy of we change the environment so that the flower can bloom, that the idea that something isn't possible, we actually start to think beyond that and start to think, well, let's make this possible? Because at the end of the day, the school system is designed very much around industrial Britain, isn't it? And working parents. And is it not an opportunity? Have we not got an opportunity to think, actually, maybe, in much the same way as working in social work, people do not tend to have their challenges between 9 and 5. In much the same way, can we start to think about school a little bit differently? Now we've learned, because we've been forced to, that there are other ways of connecting, other ways of learning, other ways of being part of something. Is this an opportunity or a crisis, I guess, is the question I'd leave hanging there. And how do we think about things we've once thought were impossible? How do we start to think about them as possible?
I think also building on that, it strikes me that this is the time whereby, and again I come back to school leaders in the first instance, where they are supported in looking at, so what principles are going to guide the practice around reintegration. So, for example, the principle one, it would be great to have staggered reintegration. If that's not practically possible, so what else then do we do? Because it is a core principle that we need to be gradual and gentle in our approaches. So if it can't be specifically through it is staggered, then how else do we do that? And not just throw the baby out with the bathwater to say, well, we can't do that, so hey, we'll just go back to business as normal.
I think we've got a model, haven't we, of what might be possible at Carr Manor in Leeds. The goal has got to be to build the smaller community within the bigger community. We know that's important. That's why we have house systems and stuff like that. I think a new emphasis on thinking about that is, essential now, isn't it? But there's a huge school where somehow they managed to divide the whole community into coaching circles of, I don't know, about 8 children who meet 3 times a week. They don't bother with form time because the thinking there is that group is too big for us to actually really create social capital through that process. So they have these a check-in at the start of the week, a midweek catch-up and a check-out at the end of the week in small coaching circles with the same coach from year 7 right the way through to year 11. And those children are known really well. And if you go there and visit, they'll say it feels like being in a family. So it is, with imagination, possible.
Anything's possible. I'm just going to answer a couple of things on the side. Lena has put me, you, Steve and Karen Tradesman forward for the way of trauma job share czar, which is very sweet. And of course the word crisis is the root of the word, means to sift, to sort the treasure from the sand. Many parents also will be reluctant for their children to come back to school, so we're going to be looking at parental anxiety around what that's going to mean, and I think that's also come up in terms of how do we work with the family? How do we work with the family so that some of those anxieties are going to be managed well? And yes, Sharon, as Callum's put up, it was calm manner that Mary mentioned. We have one last question which will take us to the end of this session. So Steve has asked, do you believe school leaders will be able to convert our concerns into collective strength to pause inspection and SATs, etc.? What a great question to finish us up.
Let's hope. I mean, there is a gathering momentum, isn't there? And as you were saying yourself earlier, Lisa, around the social care side of things, they have done that, and let's do it. What is stopping us now? Seriously, what is stopping us? Yeah.
Mary, anything to add?
Well, that one's going to be a rabble rouser. It's worth noting that Chris Dyson's tweeted this morning that he's just going to say no. He's not doing it. Yeah. He's not doing it. He's got different priorities. Yeah. He feels the DfE haven't particularly been here for him or listened to him through this crisis. So he's not feeling inclined to cooperate. He's going to put his children and his community first. Not that I'm recommending that as a local authority representative, but that's perspective.
I think if there's an opportunity for people to come together and actually say, no, this is not in the interest of this community. And we know Chris's school particularly is a school with very high need, with lots of issues going on. They've had to be very responsive because there's been so many difficulties getting hold of the luncheon vouchers for food for children on free school meals. There's been all sorts of things that actually can't wait and can't go on hold. But yeah, I'm thinking very much that if everybody can pull together on this and actually just say, no, we actually have to focus on the children, then I don't see why not. If social care, who are one of the most downtrodden sectors in existence, can turn around and go, honestly, no, we're not bringing COVID-19 into our homes because it's killing people, then I don't see any reason why the education sector can't do the same. Mary Meredith, Steve Russell, I think we pulled off a live and it's been fantastic having you on the programme today. Is there anything that either of you would just like to, I mean, we've gone out on a revolution. Is there anything else you would just like to go out on and leave as your kind of statement of intention that you'd like to leave here?
I'd like to just come back to this, because threaded throughout our webinar today, we've been talking about the positives. And it would be very understandable to focus upon, if you like, a deficit model around this. When I think back to that first weekend when the school closures were being announced, and when I was avidly connecting with school leaders via Twitter to see what they were doing, it was absolutely amazing what school leaders did there. And I think that there's also an opportunity amongst all of this practical stuff around the reintegration of school communities for school leaders, the staff and the children to come together and to celebrate what it is that's grown as a result of this. What values, which aspects of their ethos have really shone through during these really dark times. And it is a moment in time, it's a golden opportunity to do that. And I'd hope that within the busyness and the angst that again, time and space is given over to doing so in a very intentional way.
Thank you, Steve. Mary?
I think I'd like to finish with returning to that thought about a pedagogy for relationship building. I think that's so important, and maybe flagging Dan Hughes and Kim Golding in relation to that, and thinking about, as part of our training for staff, introducing the notion of PACE approaches that enable us to make connections with children who don't want to or can't make connections very well. So the idea of being playful is going to be so important after, you know, we emerge from the talk of death and destruction and misery, you know, to be playful and to have fun with children, and to realise that when we're doing banter, that's important to do because it's relationship building. Acceptance, they're going to get it wrong, they're going to challenge the boundaries sometimes, and we've got to obviously impose boundaries to keep everybody safe, but we've got to do that in a way that respects the relationship. So there's got to be relational repair. Curiosity, the importance of seeing behaviour as communication, listening to what it's saying, responding, and of course empathy, which is the real way to drive connection with children. So all staff understanding the principles of PACE and interacting with children with that held in mind, I think would be powerful. The beginning of a pedagogy for relationships.
That's beautiful, thank you. And for those of you who are interested in more on Kim Golding, I have a conversation with her on the podcast. If you are not on the podcast and you have not subscribed, you are missing out on all of these conversations. So if wherever you listen to podcasts, if you just put Lisa Cherry Trauma, which is unfortunate, into your search engine, the podcast will come up. Or if you like visuals, you can watch on YouTube. This will certainly go up on YouTube at some point as well. And just subscribe. And there, we're into season 2 now, and this is episode 16. So please do join us on the podcast. Thank you all so much for coming today. You've been amazing, and I've loved all the comments. And just the fact that you came here within 3 hours shows me, with all the challenges that you've got going on, shows me and tells me how passionate and connected and in need of this conversation you really are. So that's Trauma Resonance Resilience podcast. Thank you, Steve Russell, and thank you, Mary Meredith.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
Thank you. And thank you, Lisa. Yeah.
And thank you, listeners.